Hello, and we are live today on this Veterans Day, and I'm sitting here with Neil Carter over Skype. And if you don't know, he writes for Godless and Dixie on Pathos, and I'd highly suggest you looking him up both on Facebook, Pathos, and Twitter. His Twitter handle is right down there. Definitely follow him on Twitter and everywhere because he's an amazing writer and a guy that I've met at the American Atheist Conference as well as other conferences that I've been going to this year. And today I want to start out by talking about this whole Joshua Feuerstein and the cup situation. I want to know what your take on the whole situation is.
Well, it's a pretty inane discussion, obviously. You ever heard the phrase "storm in a teacup"?
Yeah.
That's kind of quite literally what this is. It's a media generated non-issue. I've been talking with a number of Christian friends, and what I'm hearing from them is none of them care. I'm not even sure who does. Enough days have passed now, and it's filtered through the different channels. And even an assistant editor at Charisma magazine, which is pretty fundamentalist, wrote an opinion piece that said, "This is dumb. Why are we talking about this?"
Right.
Nobody seems to actually care about this except for media outlets and however you say ballcap guy's name. I've never learned to say it correctly. Who really is like his own kind of self-made media. I mean, he makes a living off of generating events out of nothing. And I think everybody else is wising up to that, even a number of people in the Christian circles, and they're saying, this is not even a thing for us.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, I don't know if you saw the CNN interview that he did, but CNN had him on,
Yeah.
and basically, apparently, like the guy. I don't know if the guy was just speculating because of the way that Josh Feuerstein looks or something, but he said that he was a Chaz Bono impersonator, and I found that particularly hilarious.
Wow, that's really
uh,
something.
yeah,
I'm
but
actually I'm actually Facebook friends with his wife, with Feuerstein's wife, which is weird. I'm not sure how that happened.
really,
So I see some stuff sometimes showing up, and I'm thinking this is an odd personality. It's a personality generated for the purpose of the internet only. Don't know what the man's like in real life, but CNN had him on because it's again that's the kind of thing that media feeds off of. They like to generate crisis where there is none, and that's what this is.
right, exactly. And I mean, particularly Feuerstein, he likes to, which ironically I think it's in German, that actually means Flintstone, is what I've heard.
Is that right? I don't.
Yeah, yeah. I have no idea. I haven't verified that, but I've heard a lot of people say, "Hey, in German that means Flintstone."
I don't know German, but I want to say that's Firestone, but I could be
Oh,
wrong.
okay.
I don't
But
know.
But yeah, a lot of people speculate about Feuerstein. But from what I've been able to research and gather is that his parents work for the Mayo Clinic out in Arizona, and he doesn't really have a job. He's had two failed ministries prior to this, and then he shut them down and actually like officially closed them like as a business, and he started his whole social media thing, and so that's pretty much the how Feuerstein started, and then he got in touch with some social media managers and basically blew his page up to about 2 million people now. From I know when people started really noticing him, he was at like 700,000 already, but then he jumped up to almost 2 million in less than a year, and
Yeah.
so
Well, I've actually made a prediction before that aside from the sensationalism that he represents, I think that he represents a trend that maybe is going to be the future of ministry within the church. Right now, I think if you look at what happens in the free thought community, they don't have a lot of central locations, real life places with buildings that they go to like Christians do. But that requires a lot of overhead. It requires a lot of monthly and weekly giving that continues to be on the decline for churches. And on the other hand, internet usage is up. And contrary to a lot of my friends who seem to think that the presence of the internet means religion's going to go away, they don't realize that churches can use the internet too, and preachers can make YouTube videos as well. Um, I think what's going to happen is we're going to see a shift of churches, especially evangelical churches, to online communities. They've already begun that to some degree, but I think pastors and their ministries will also merge online to the point that you won't so much belong to a place that you go to week after week, but I could see 50 years down the road people belonging to subcultures that coalesce online, as it were, and that center around central personalities whose styles and whose approaches and vocabulary matches different people's preferences. And you can just sponsor them on Patreon or something similar. Like I said, I think they're going to come up with something called Faithion or some cheesy copy of Patreon. And that'll be a way that you can give and support them. And it requires no overhead. All you got to do is have a basement and a video camera,
Right.
and you can create celebrity out of nothing at all.
Well, I mean, you can even go even lower than that and just have an iPhone, like Feuerstein does. I mean, he still does the vertical video and everything, even though it's not really that hard to turn it.
He's famous for that.
Side. Yeah, I know.
He's famous for that. He's also famous for raising something like $20,000 or more to buy a really fancy camera that apparently he doesn't own or never uses.
No. Yeah, actually, there's a video on my channel where I discussed that called Feuerstein's Fraudulent Funding. And, the actual camera that he was wanting to buy was only about $2,000. And then I guess he was getting about $18,000 worth of extras to pile onto it. But then, as he's running the campaign, he had a video that he posted on his page where he was using a Red One camera.
That's confusing.
I talked to Seth Andrews a little bit later, and he said that he had actually been paying a camera crew to follow him around at one point. So I'm wondering if maybe that was it. Like he paid a camera crew to follow him around with a Red One or something like that. And then there's this guy, Matt Kovacs of Miami Valley Skeptics in Ohio. He actually confronted Feuerstein at one of his speaking engagements, and apparently Feuerstein used the money to buy 2 5K cameras or something and a studio is what he ended up spending the money on. So nobody knows what he did with that money, but the nearest that I could speculate is that he used GoFundMe because he's guaranteed the money, and he did that so that he would actually get the money, and it was pretty much just a scam to get revenue and produce.
It's a believable story.
Yeah. But that's all speculation. But anyways, enough of Feuerstein. What we're here
Speaking
to
of speculation, our next topic.
Yeah, our main topic for today is did Jesus exist? Now, I'm of the persuasion that Jesus didn't exist. That's my belief. But I, as far as knowledge goes, I say that he probably didn't. I think the probabilities are on the side of him being more myth than actual historical person. But I know that you kind of hold an opposite position. And I wonder if you could start off by elaborating on that a little bit.
Okay. I only brought this up last week because people began recirculating an article from a year ago that had been, frankly, torn to shreds on at least a couple of different occasions, and I thought the article was gone. I thought that it wasn't going to come back again, but it came back again, and it got reshared all over again. And my post on Facebook on my private wall was, or was it on my public wall too? I can't remember. It was on both. Was about that article. That article was, frankly, fraudulent in its claims because it went far afield from what historians can actually claim, even who want to claim the mythicist position. So, to frame this question, my first question is: when you say you think it's probable that Jesus didn't exist, I have two questions. First of all, do you hear the difference between saying it's probable that Jesus didn't exist versus Jesus did not exist? You see the difference between those two statements?
Well, no,
to say it different.
I do, but I guess I see the first one as more of a, that's what I believe. I believe he didn't exist. And then the other one is more of a knowledge claim saying that he probably didn't exist.
Right. It sounds a lot like agnosticism versus atheism.
Well, yeah.
Right. Okay. So just like you do with a debate about God, I think my next logical question is to ask, just like you would say, wait, which God are we talking about? because the way we approach the question is going to be different depending on which way we go. So my question is, when you say you don't think Jesus existed, which one are you talking about? Are you talking about magic Jesus of the church's legend? Or are you talking about that no Jesuses could have existed of any kind? We need to clarify which kind we're talking
Right.
about.
Exactly. Since we're both atheists, and we know that the magical claims of the Bible obviously aren't based in reality. So I would say that I think that we're both in agreement that this magical or supernatural Jesus that did all these miracles and everything didn't exist, but a more minimalistic, like, historical Jesus, as him being like a preacher, going around at the time and preaching, his word or whatnot. I think that's where we kind of both stand on this. Am I correct?
Well, I think that's what I'm asking you is which one is it we're debating? Because the answers are totally different. And what I end up seeing happening is whenever this discussion comes up, people switch back and forth. They fail to distinguish between whether they're talking about magic Jesus or just a regular guy who had layers of legend put on top of him.
Right.
So
Well,
let's assume for the sake of argument, we're talking not about a magic guy,
right.
but we're talking about a regular Joe who lived in rural Palestine and died relatively young for whatever reasons, maybe caught up in some sort of a political climate where people got killed a lot, for whether for good reasons or not. And we're debating whether or not that guy existed, upon which layers of legend got added later on. Is that a fair way to frame what we're talking about?
Well, yeah. Sorry, that's what I was trying to suggest earlier. But yeah, that's a lot better way to put it. I
Well,
would say
okay.
that we're both arguing against, or we're both the subject of the argument is that particular type of Jesus.
Okay. So my feeling about that is, first of all, that I have studied history formally, and I've studied biblical history formally, and I've been exposed to a pretty wide variety of scholarship, both from within the church and also outside the church. And I don't know if people realize that a very large portion of academics who study the Bible formally, professors at state universities and private universities in the United States and Britain and in Europe and lots of other places, they formally study the New Testament and the Old Testament. A large portion of them have no faith whatsoever. They are not a part of the Christian faith. And they are a part of an academic discipline that it took many of them decades to reach their level of achievement in their field. And that field of study has overwhelmingly conceded that they think that there was a historical person on which layers of legend have been laid. To my knowledge, I can name between 2 and 4 people out of, I would guess, tens of thousands, 2 to maybe 4 people who are within that field of academic study of antiquity, who claim that no Jesus was even there underneath all of the layers of legend at all. Which doesn't mean I rule it out automatically. It just means that when I'm looking at a formal academic discipline, I don't immediately assume that the 2 outliers have it right and the other thousands don't. And what I see in the atheist community is a reversal of those 2 things. I see a willingness to jump to the conclusion that even an article that I said has been shredded multiple times, the claim about 126, historical writings, it's a terrible article at so many different layers, and that people just pass it around uncritically, just like they did. I think it was 2 years ago when was it Joseph Atwill? Was that his name?
Yeah.
Robert Atwill? I can't remember his first name. He wrote a thesis. By the way, he also does not have formal credentials in studying, biblical studies. I'm not even sure if he had a history degree. I can't even remember. I'd have to look. I know it wasn't in classics. And he claimed that the entire Jesus story got made up like maybe in the 300s, which is absurd because we have documents predating that not only
Well,
talk about Jesus, but also that talk about Jesus in such a way that the formal study of those documents reveals that there's layers underneath that would be even older from the oral tradition and that sort of thing. So to date it at the Council of Nicaea is ignorant.
Well, yeah, because I mean, even the core of the Gospels, our earliest versions of that are shown to be written, even in the first century.
Right.
So
So, which doesn't mean that everything that they say in there is true, but you're familiar with the concept of parsimony? In science and in philosophy and in other fields, parsimoniousness means that you don't reach for the more complicated expressions or theories if simpler ones are better. If simpler explanations are just as competent at explaining something as the complicated ones, you start with the simpler ones. That's what Occam's razor is about. If we apply that to how you study antiquity, the most logical explanation for how we ended up with the vast body of mythology around Jesus that we have is that there probably was a guy that was a part of a story that later on got multiple layers on top of it, and it's been greatly embellished. But what's weird to me is that even though I'm willing to acknowledge that it's possible that there never even was a guy underneath all the layers, the level of certainty that I seem to be getting from my atheist friends online is disproportionate to what the actual formal study of the field suggests. And I would go so far as to say it almost makes me think about the Ben Carson flub recently, where it became obvious, or it became apparent that he got up in front of a bunch of people and said, you know what, I don't care what Egyptologists say. What do they know? They don't know anything. They say they can read stuff on the walls. I don't believe any of them. I think it was all to store grain. And I say this because I'm a neurologist. So clearly I know a lot about Egyptology. So with the wave of a hand, he dismissed an entire formal discipline about which he knew very little. So one of the things I want to ask people when they start saying, I'm just convinced there was no Jesus of any kind, not even just a regular Joe. Before I ask them which Jesus are we talking about, the next question I ask is, can you tell me the difference between form criticism and tradition criticism? Or do you know the difference between redaction criticism and textual criticism? Usually they look at me like redaction criticism, form criticism, source criticism. Do you know what the differences are between those? If not, it's
no.
probably because you might not have ever formally studied ancient documents. There's a multi-layered approach to studying historical documents of antiquity. And it involves picking apart the pieces of it to try to figure out how these documents came to be and how they came to be in the form that they finally are. There's all kinds of formal tools that are used that the historian learns and goes to school to learn. And when I hear someone getting online because they read a Richard Carrier article or they watched a Richard Carrier video, they then get online and say, I'm certain Jesus didn't exist. He couldn't have. And then with the wave of a hand, they dismiss what is an overwhelming consensus among the people who actually formally study this, both believers and non-believers. And I don't think that they're aware of just how much work they're dismissing with the wave of a hand. But the people who do formally study it, including Robert Price and Richard Carrier, will admit that they know that they are outliers. They think they're correct, but they know that they're standing against the overwhelming consensus of their formal field. And if I could interject something that somebody pointed out to me not too long ago, Dan Finca brought this up on Patheos a couple of years ago. And he said, it doesn't make us look good, especially when we try to argue against religion in general. And a part of our apologetic method or our polemic is that we want to say Jesus never existed. And in so doing, they display that there's a lot of things they don't know about how this stuff is even done formally among the historians. And Finca argued that that's actually not making us look good because we're speaking about things we don't actually know about because we've never formally studied them. And Carrier agreed with him and posted about it on his blog. And I want to read to you a couple of things that Richard said. This was, 2013, right about the time that he was releasing his big book on the historicity of Jesus. He quotes Finca as saying this, amateurs should not be voicing certitude in a matter still being debated by experts. Okay. A little bit later on, he said, until secular historians, and this is quoting Dan, until secular historians at least become widely divided over the matter of historicity, atheists who are not themselves experts in that field should not be advocating for one side or the other routinely or prominently. And I agree with Richard. Basically, what Richard is saying is, look, this is a matter for historians to debate, specifically historians of antiquity, which Richard legitimately is. And that's the reason why everybody keeps quoting him, because he does significant work on the matter. But even he would acknowledge that, number one, there are probabilities that the historical Jesus is a real thing. He just generally thinks that it's a very small probability, but he puts a great deal of range. Like, he puts the probability between 1 and 12,000 and between 1 and 3, which is a significant margin. But anyway, so let me read you one more thing from Richard's post. Again, quoting Dan favorably. The notion of a God-man who performed miracles and who rose from the dead is preposterous. But then Kira goes on to say, you don't need to sandbag your own case for that conclusion by adding onto it the controversial and still largely untested possibility that Jesus didn't exist. That makes you an easy mark for straw man arguments. But worse, it activates an innate human cognitive bias in any Christian you might be trying to persuade. If a conclusion is defended with a weak argument and a strong argument, anyone biased against that conclusion will assume you only had the weak argument. And then Richard goes on to cite Valerie Terrico as well, who is herself a mythicist, but makes that point that you need to be careful about how you put forth your arguments. And if you want to argue against the magic Jesus, you've got a giant target that's impossible to miss. But to then go and argue against a historical, plain, regular Joe Jesus, you're making your target a lot smaller, and you may be going up against people who know better than you do that there's a large body of historical study behind this that doesn't come to as simple of a conclusion as you do.
Right. On my channel here, I have a series called "Did Jesus Exist?" where I actually argue against a historical Jesus. But as you said, that there are two very different paths to take: one, the magical one, and the minimalist kind of historical person. And I've been focusing more on debunking the magical version of Jesus that a lot of Christians seem to think is actual, like it is real, that actually happened. And I do have to agree that if you're going to attack the more minimalistic one, you have to be a lot better trained in it. But I'm just kind of curious, how do you differ your position from just a simple appeal to authority or a bandwagon?
The problem with an appeal to authority is when it's not that all appeals to authority are invalid. That's not what the fallacy of the appeal to authority is. The appeal to authority, I'll give you a similar example. Ad hominem is only a fallacy if the character of the person you're attacking is not relevant to the argument.
Right.
It's not an ad hominem argument if the character of the person that you're addressing is actually central to the argument that they are making. Okay, so if what we're doing is we're arguing that a large number of historians, many of them not even theistic in any way at all, which is one of the deep dark secrets of the formal study of the New Testament, is that a large number of the theologians and the people who study this formally have lost all practical faith of any kind. That's why they're in academia, because there's no place else for them to be. They can't be in the pulpit anymore, but they're hardly even theists at all. But once you make that claim that the overwhelming majority of them have not themselves become convinced by the mythicist position, that's not an appeal to authority, because it's central to the argument of what you're trying to say, that the people who are legitimately authorities in an academic field do in fact overwhelmingly have a consensus in this matter. Let me use another example. If I were to try to tell you that I think that climate change is real and that it is anthropogenic, human beings are causing a change in our atmosphere through the things we've created and the way we live. If I were to tell you that 97% of climatologists agree with that, would that be a bandwagon argument? No, because I'm appealing to people who are legitimately experts in that field. But you have to first acknowledge that there is a formal discipline of climate science. I'll acknowledge the one limitation with the analogy is that climate science is a hard science, but history is more of a soft science. It's not as easy to come up with measurements for events that happened 2,000 years ago, which is why I don't think you can say with certainty in either direction whether the regular Joe Jesus really happened. But one question I would want to ask is, so let's assume for the sake of argument that the regular Joe guy did really live. How much non-religious, how much official Roman evidence would you expect to find for a rural preacher in Podunk, Palestine, to actually have survived? You know, that there would not have been any reason for anybody important to even chronicle it. A good example would be that article that got passed around again last week that said that there are 126 sources of historical documents. Somebody went through and picked those apart, and they said 47 of those 126 historical documents don't even exist anymore. Like, we don't even have them available to examine. So for the guy who incidentally has also never studied history formally, he's like an aerospace engineer, the guy that wrote that article, for him to say that there's 126, he's already lied right out of the gate. 47 of them you can't even go see because they don't exist. So then you start going through and looking at the rest of his list, and he's got poets, he's got astrologers, he's got ancient sort of scientist type people. They're like, there's mathematicians, there's a lot of different fields there, and artists of various kinds, but very few that are actual historians that were chronicling anything that was even. One of the people on his list predated the time of Jesus by 100 years. And I'm like, why would that even be on the list? Then you whittle it down to the people who actually are historians who are writing about the right time period. Out of those 126, only 31 of them are actual historians that would have been covering the same time period. But most of them didn't cover Palestine because nobody cared about Palestine. It was like a backwater in the Roman Empire. Nobody cared what happened there. But even among those, a few of them wrote about Palestine, maybe 4 or 5 pages total out of all of their works. And I'm again asking, how much would you expect a rural preacher who was essentially poor and died in his young 30s to show up in their stuff? Not the magic guy, because remember, we're not assuming that was even a real guy. I'm talking about regular Joe Jesus. The amazing thing is he actually does show up in a handful of writers from that time period, from 1st and 2nd and 3rd century. So anyway, all that to say that I see some parallels here. If I were to come out and say, you know what, 3% of climatologists do think that everybody else is wrong. So what if I sided with those 3%? And what if I spent so much time reading only those 3% that I got to where I forgot the other 90% even had a different view? I would probably become more and more confident that my view was the right view, which incidentally is what Fox News does. And, you know, they surround themselves with people who think the same way they do, and they forget that they live inside of a minority, and the people who disagree with them are actually specialists in the field that they know nothing about. So when a broadcast journalism major gets in front of a camera and dismisses 97% of climate science, having never studied it, because they can find 3% that disagree with it, I feel a little bit the same way when somebody who has never formally studied antiquity says, I'm certain there could never have been a Jesus, because I know 2 guys in the field of antiquity studies that think the same way I do. That's great. I'm glad you do, but that's just a start.
Yeah, but I'm kind of curious. If you could compare that to the whole lead being added to our environment in like the 70s and 80s, you know, because there was an overwhelming consensus at the time that we weren't adding lead to our environment, and then you had the one lone scientist that went out, did the research, and then came back and argued against the consensus that we weren't adding it, and it turns out he was right.
All right. So who figured out that he was right, and who determined that? The other scientists, right?
Yes.
Not broadcast journalists.
Well, no, I'm not arguing. Yeah, I'm not arguing for like a broadcast journalist being the one that convinces everybody. I'm just saying that you know, to say that just because only a few people hold this position, it doesn't negate their position. You know, it does. No, it doesn't. That's not reason to prove it wrong.
No, it's not. But the way that the consensus is changed is by people within the field having an intramural debate amongst themselves, presenting their case to each other, and letting the people who are experts in that field peer reviewing what they are finding. It's something that peers within that field have to determine. And that's what Richard is saying about the matter of historicity. He's essentially saying, this is a matter for historians to debate. This is not something for people who have never formally studied the subject, need to stick their neck out about and stake their claim on something that they haven't formally studied. It's something for the historians to debate. And so Richard wrote a big, thick book for other historians to read and examine and peer review and to keep the debate going. I applaud him in that. That's exactly the way it needs to be done. And now his peers are going to come along and they're going to pick apart what he's done and they're going to examine what he has presented. And over time, they're going to sift this evidence and decide whether more than just whatever percentage of them think this. I don't even think it's 3% of biblical scholars that would hold to the mythicist position. It's probably less than 1%. But I'm willing to concede that, number one, it's a softer science. And number two, that those who are still a part of some sort of church tradition are going to be greatly biased in their study of the New Testament. And I acknowledge that. But I think that even if you were to eliminate all of them, just take the agnostic and atheist scholars, even among them, the mythicist position is still such a minority that there's going to be a lot more debate that needs to happen before I'm willing to say, you know what, you're right. That's actually a good point. I hadn't thought of that. You know, I'm not saying that it matters ultimately that truth is determined by the numbers, but I'm saying that it is something that has to be solved among them first. And we don't need to be acting like we know more than we really do. Certainly not making claims of certainty, which I'm not making. And usually when I push back, people end up backing off of certainty as well, saying, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe there was a guy, but he's nothing like what he became later in mythology. And I'd say, well, great, then we're in agreement.
Yeah. Well, you know, as far as the consensus and whatnot, you know, for me, I feel like it should really be, you know, based on their evidence. Well, like, you know, the evidence that they present, not the fact that it's a consensus or anything like that, but, you know, like in the instance of climate change. And I know I'm kind of going back a little bit in our conversation here, but in the instance of climate change, you know, it's not really that all these scientists have formed a consensus. It's that all of the scientists' research has proven, you know, has shown consistency with each other and has proven that so that they have a consensus. So to me, it's more of their research, their proof that substantiates the consensus, not the fact that there is a consensus. And go ahead.
Well, let me interject there. So what would constitute evidence for regular Joe Jesus? I think that what may be happening here is that people who don't do this for a living, and I don't do it for a living either, but I have formally studied it, and I know what goes into it. The kinds of things that you would call evidence for determining the historicity of an otherwise obscure figure from an obscure area of an empire that no longer exists, that actually wouldn't have cared about daily events going on in that obscure area. The process of establishing evidentially the existence of a person from that time period is really, really fuzzy. It's going to be necessarily limited, and the kinds of things that would count as evidence are not going to look like evidence to everybody. They're really not. When I talked about form criticism and source criticism, and tradition criticism and redaction criticism and textual criticism, these are tools that historians use when they are studying antiquity to figure out what's really going on underneath stories, underneath reports of events and of conversations and movements. And it's complicated stuff, and it's not a hard science. So when you say, I want to see more evidence, I guess one thing I want to know is how much evidence do you really need to believe that there was a guy, just a regular guy? And why is it that big of a deal? Like, I don't quite understand why the simplest explanation, which is just that, yeah, there probably was a guy, and then they made up stuff about him later because it didn't go at all like they thought it would. They thought he was going to be, you know, the Jews were looking for a deliverer. The Jews were looking for, many of them were looking for somebody to overthrow the Roman government because they were tired of oppression at the time. And several of them seem to have circled around this one guy thinking he was one of them. And as the story goes, he was killed because the Romans looked at him as one of those too, an insurrectionist. And just a few years later, there actually was an insurrection And the Romans wiped out the Jews, burned the town down, and they had to disperse in 70 AD. We know what kinds of political movements were going on at the time, and it's not at all difficult to believe that several people ended up getting killed because they were thought to be insurgents. And maybe this guy even was an insurgent. Maybe later on they went back and made him more of a pacifist because he was killed, and that destroyed their narrative. So they had to go back and reinvent who Jesus was, and they had to make him somebody who always planned to die. Oh, that was his plan from the very beginning. So then you begin to develop this theology of the cross, and you reverse engineer the whole story to make it sound like this was the plan all along. Then you go back and you read the Old Testament, you're like, oh yeah, there's this verse over here that says something about a suffering servant, so maybe that's what this is. I can see how the process would play out of reverse engineering the story to make it work. And we can pick apart those layers and see the development of a theology. But again, the most logical explanation is there probably was a guy at the beginning, but it's kind of irrelevant at this point. The only reason it matters to me to even have this discussion is because I see such disproportionate certainty from people that there never could have been a guy. And I'm like, why do you go that far? Why does that even have to be the thing that you're arguing for? Again, why aiming for such the tiny target when there's a giant target, which is, okay, so if there really was a magic Jesus, then what would we expect to be happening today, to evidence that? Because I don't think you can go back to something 2,000 years ago and definitively say what did or didn't happen. For one thing, they kept crappy records back then. And even the official records that you find are somebody's interpretation of something. Technically speaking, even if we go to the pyramids and start reading the hieroglyphics, you're reading somebody's interpretation of what was happening. And it's probably the official interpretation that was sponsored by whoever was ruling at the time. And we all know how that goes and how accurate those sorts of stories are. So maybe somebody could go along and say, you know what, based on a different reading of this hieroglyphic here, we think maybe the pyramids really were about storing grain. And all the Egyptologists have it wrong. And never mind the fact that we're just a tiny minority that thinks that. The rest of them are all wrong because, we have it right. And anyway, I'm getting off the subject. But you see my point.
I do. But I just feel like that type of reasoning, using the fact that, well, not a lot of people were covering the news of the current events of Palestine or whatnot around that time. It just seems like you could argue for the existence of unicorns back then. Just because nobody recorded them. Apparently that means that they could have existed.
Okay, so let's say that we're not arguing for unicorns. Let's say that I know about a guy named Bob, or better yet, let's call him Brian. You ever seen The Life of Brian?
Yes. Okay,
so let's say there was a guy named Brian. And let's say that over the course of time, this guy Brian got mistaken to be something that he wasn't. Some stories got spun about his significance. Maybe the guy Brian didn't even want the stories to be told. Maybe it was just baloney and he knew it, but he couldn't get away from it. And people wanted to make him into something that he wasn't. And then later on, he disappeared and nothing, was ever heard of him again. If I wanted to say there was a guy named Brian at that time, how would anybody go along disproving me that there was a guy named Brian? And what sorts of evidence would it even require for us to say for certain that there couldn't have been a guy named Brian? And why does it even matter? Again, I'm not claiming that Brian was a unicorn. I'm saying he was a regular guy with no magical powers. So why is it a big deal to anybody whether or not that guy really existed? I can't quite figure it out.
Well, for me personally, as far as Brian or Jesus or anything, shattering that base of the Christian religion to me seems to be kind of important, considering
Bingo.
How much religion controls our society.
Let me stop you right there. Okay. That is exactly what Dan Finca and what Richard Carrier argued is a bad idea. You should not be using the historicity question, which is far from decided by the people who formally study these things. You should not be using that, which is a very tendentious argument, and basing your polemic about the Christian faith on that. There are so many other things that could be addressed. Like, for example, the thing that I always go back to is that the Christian faith makes a number of claims, very unambiguous claims about the effect of prayer, about healing. There's places in the Bible that talk about giving money and getting things back in return. There are claims made by the Christian faith which are easy to examine. And even Christians have had to go back and re-examine those and say, you know what, actually, we kind of don't believe those things anymore because we can't really support that with real life. Those are very large targets. And when I see these giant targets, I'm wondering, why is it that we're not going after those things and we're instead reaching for something that is not a clear path at all? And that's what I'm trying to argue about, is that I think that's the wrong approach to take. I agree that on an emotional level, if we could have definitive proof that there never was a Jesus of any kind, it would be a devastating blow to a lot of believers. Although I believe they would actually find a way to still hold on to their belief regardless of what historians find. They would just decide it's conspiracy theory, that people are out to attack the Christian faith, and they'll just branch off and decide that now they can't even trust their own biblical historians anymore, and they'll just further, sequester themselves from the rest of the world, just like people do all the time in religions, I could see that happening, but I just think that's the wrong path to go. And I think Carrier agrees with me, and so does Dan Finca. So we've got a philosopher and a historian. I don't even know if Dan's a mythicist or not, but Richard is. And incidentally, Richard butchered that At Will book that came out a couple of years ago. And part of his argument was, okay, it's great if you want to be a mythicist, but let's not use really crappy arguments. At least learn to be a critical consumer. And I would imagine he would say the same thing about the article that's being passed around about the 126 documents. If you really believe that what you're saying is based in real life and in real history, then you should be able to examine the things that you're sharing on social media. We get onto Christians all the time about sharing stuff without checking to see if it's legitimate. And yet I have so many atheist friends that have reshared and reshared and reshared the At Will articles, and they've reshared the thing about the 126. And when I try to tell them, you realize that this argument is written by somebody with no credentials whatsoever in New Testament studies, and it's full of errors, they then get mad at me for disagreeing with their thesis, instead of saying,
Well,
you know what, you're right, that's a bad argument.
Well, ironically, I get a lot of anger towards me when I say that I don't think Jesus exists. And I supply my arguments for it. But just to clarify, I don't think that like that's not my main, I guess, attack on Christianity is the historicity of Jesus. I mean, at least on my channel and on my Facebook page and everything, I attack the bigger, larger targets. It's just that it's kind of like this whole "did Jesus exist?" question is kind of like a I guess a passion of mine. Like I like researching it. I like reading about it, and so that's why I'm making content for it, and I'm keeping the conversation going.
Have you read Ehrman's book then?
I'm actually currently I'm reading it, but from what I've seen out of Bart Ehrman, I'm still not convinced. It really does just seem like, oh, there's a hole in recorded history here, so Jesus existed, and just using the fact that there wasn't a lot of recording of history going on at the time. They're using that hole to say, oh, well, Jesus existed then, just because he wouldn't have been recorded. It just kind of seems like a really easy cop out to me, to say that instead of providing proof that he actually did exist. Because I mean, there are certain documents back then that like satirical articles and whatnot that lambast failed prophets of the time, and even lesser prophets than Jesus would have been.
Right, he was obscure, from what I understand.
Well, yeah, but I mean, even some more obscure like doomsday preachers and whatnot of the time that were preaching different ideas were recorded. Now, granted, I can't name right off the top of my head the different works that these people appear in, but I need to look that up. But given from Richard Carrier's research, as well as David Fitzgerald's work and Price's work, I mean, the way that I stand on it is that in the Old Testament and the Septuagint, there's a perfect recipe for a mythical Christ, a mythical person within the Jewish mythology for Christ already existed, like There was a figure in the Jewish mythology that is Christ, basically, already existed, because they were expecting him to come, right? And
Do you think that they would have expected him to be killed?
yeah, there's a lot of different foreshadowing in the Old Testament as to how he would die
According
and
to,
whatnot.
okay.
I mean, but just because of the perfect recipe for that, plus if you combine that with Paul, he says that he got his message or his gospel from no man. He got it from a revelation from Christ and from scriptures. Now, at the time, it's not like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those scriptures existed when Paul was writing his stuff. So what scriptures was he talking about? He was talking about the Old Testament and the Septuagint,
Right. Well,
those collection of writings.
there were oral traditions that predate Paul, though. There's evidence of the oral traditions even present in Paul's letters. So you can't say that things began with Paul and that was the first of everything. Just because
Well,
that's when things began to be written, it's not that simple.
Well, no. I wasn't trying to suggest that. I was just connecting it with Paul because Paul seems to be a very prominent writer of the Bible and
Yes.
of all of the different of what we know about Jesus, basically. And there are a lot of oral traditions that predate that, but um, that kind of goes into the whole mystery faith area, like. Because there was an amalgam of different mystery faiths that existed at the time, and I know like David Fitzgerald and Carrier, they both present the idea that Christianity wasn't just like over the mystery faiths, like the mystery faith spawned off of Christianity, but Christianity was just a mystery faith amongst the amalgam of mystery faiths, and then then it eventually won out.
Okay. Well, the reason I find that a difficult thesis to accept, just off the face of it, is that there is a great deal of dissimilarity between the type of Jesus you get from Paul and the type of Jesus you get from the Gospels. And it looks obvious to me that the development of the mythical Jesus went from the simpler apocalyptic preacher of the Gospels to the more mystical, ethereal creature that Paul hardly ever calls Jesus, but calls him the Christ. And John Dominique Crossan has done a lot of writing about the development from Jesus to Christ, and that to me is a believable thesis. It's a believable thesis that there was a historical figure named Jesus who was developed into the Christ. And what you're saying is the Christ came first, and the Jesus grew out of that the other direction. Carrier's hypothesis is that he started with the myth, and he was later historicized, rather than starting with a historical figure who was then mythicized. Again, that is an outlier among to me the most otherwise believable theories about how Jesus came to be who he ended up becoming in the storytelling of the church.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's happened before in history.
It just doesn't seem to me that it would make sense to go from the version of Jesus that Paul has and develop it into what you end up with in the Gospels. If it went in that direction, the dissimilarity is so great that the explanation for the changes makes a lot more sense in the opposite direction. It makes more sense that they would then have to go back and reverse engineer what happened to explain why the guy got killed and build an entire theology of the cross and of suffering around that, and then look for proof texts in the Old Testament. I guess I'm just saying that to me is a more believable explanation.
Well, no, I mean, it's pretty understandable why Jesus had to die and the way that he had to die. Because, I mean, if you think about it in the actual Bible as it exists now, you've got the Jesus and Barabbas thing, which is significant of the Yom Kippur ritual, and then, how they've had, like in the Old Covenant, they had to sacrifice, animals and whatnot in order to atone for their sins. Well, then the only way to do away with that is to have one ultimate sacrifice, and that would be God himself. Like God himself became flesh, came down and sacrificed himself, and that was the blood offering.
Yeah, but do you understand that from the Jewish mindset, that's blending categories that don't blend?
What do
The
you
very
mean?
concept that, I'm actually borrowing a little bit from the arguments of the Christian theologians here, which is crazy for me to be in that position, but this is one of those moments where I have to agree with them. It makes more sense that 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 there's this what's called a criteria of embarrassment, that the early followers of Jesus, who were, again, I think, a very tiny band of people at the beginning, they had to go back and try to explain why their guy got killed, and they had to go back and they had to reimagine why this would have happened. And honestly, they weren't that successful in the beginning. It wasn't until Paul came along that he had a cohesive vision of how he could make all this fit together in a believable story. And because it was envisioned in such a way that that Jesus's people were no longer about having to get circumcised and be Jewish, but now it's something that could appeal to anybody, because now circumcision is of the heart, whatever that means. He made it something universalizable to all kinds of people, and then it took off, and it was successful. His version became successful, and that became the official version. But up until that point, there was a mess for them to clean up, because it wasn't supposed to go that way. And the concept of, yeah, okay, so there's sheep, and the sheep get slaughtered in the Old Testament. So yeah, there's a precedent with Judaism, but in this story, it'd be like the high priest deciding, instead of killing sheep, he's just going to lie down and run a sword through himself. It doesn't make any sense. There's not a whole lot of precedent in it for them to blend the category of God and the suffering servant. I think that's something that's an innovation of the Christians.
Well, I mean, human sacrifice is pretty predominant in the Old Testament.
But not divine sacrifice. That's discontinuous with the way they saw things. That's an innovation that needs an explanation. And I don't see how you could have started with that innovation that blends categories that dramatically for the Jewish people, and then argue that after that they went back and created a historical figure. It makes a lot more sense to me that it went the other way around. Their guy got killed, they were embarrassed by it, so they went back and they changed the way they looked at the Old Testament and said, oh, well, maybe instead of the sheep dying, maybe God does. I don't know. That to me makes more sense.
Well, I know one popular argument against the argument for embarrassment is that, how do you know that would have been embarrassing to them at the time? I mean, even you yourself say that we don't have, we don't have any historical writings of him. Or
we have the Jewish writings. We know the Old Testament. We know what their culture is like. We have a lot of writings about Second Temple Judaism. We have the rabbinical tradition. We have a ton of stuff for that. If we're just talking about what was the expectation of the Jews at that time, I would say that we have a strong reason to suggest that this was a major innovation to make. And there has to be some kind of explanation for why that jump was made. And to me, a logical explanation is that they had to explain why their guy got killed. That makes the most sense.
Well, yeah. What about the? Have you heard of the book called The Ascension of Isaiah?
Ascension of Isaiah?
Yeah.
Seems like I've looked at it once before. I don't remember.
Okay, well, it's one of Carrier's major points about why he thinks that Christ is a myth, or started out as a myth, because in the Ascension of Isaiah, basically Isaiah, he ascends to heaven, and then basically he witnesses, Jesus coming down to the lower heavens and being crucified by the devil, and then the devil doesn't know who he is. And so when the devil crucifies him, and all of our sins are absolved or whatnot, that's a really rough and basic overview of what the Ascension of Isaiah is. Okay. And
I'll have to go look into that. I've got Carrier's book. I'll have to turn to that and look at it.
Yeah, to me that using these extra biblical sources that talk more about the Jewish mythology and the different kinds of Jesuses is really what makes me think that he was a myth.
That
Now,
there couldn't have been any at all of any Jesuses in reality. It just seems
well,
like a jump to me.
well, no. I'm saying that he probably didn't. Like, I don't believe that he existed, but I'm saying that he, like, from a knowledge point, it's like he. I think the probability. I'm with Carrier in saying that the probability is on the lower end that he actually existed. Now, going back a little ways in the conversation, you talked about a handful of texts that actually mention Jesus in that were either in the first or second century, and I'm kind of curious, which text are you speaking about specifically?
Well, okay, so Jesus shows up in Pliny the Younger, he shows up in Tacitus, and he shows up in Josephus. There's at least portions of the Josephus passages that are disputed, but not every mention of Jesus is necessarily disputed.
Well,
The point. Okay, I'm listening.
sorry. Well,
That's
I was
okay.
just going to stop you right there on Josephus because
I knew you would.
there's two instances in Josephus where Jesus is mentioned. The first one, though, is pretty much been proven to be fraudulent, to be inserted later.
You're talking about a phrase. There's a phrase within the passage that the experts in Josephus now think was an interpolation. I agree with that.
Well, no,
That does
that's
not
the
mean that every mention
well, no, I
is
think
wrong.
that that's the second one. I'm talking about the paragraph that's basically a glowing advertisement for Jesus.
That's the one I'm talking about.
Oh,
My
well,
understanding is, a few years ago, I had to attend a Society of Biblical Literature meeting, and a friend of mine who is a biblio blogger by trade actually dragged me into this meeting where basically the 8 or 9 world's foremost authorities on Josephus were in a panel, and they were asking questions, and the disputed passages about Jesus came up. And they bantied around a lot of different suggestions. But the one thing that I left that room fairly convinced of was that, generally speaking, while the people who represented the leaders in this specific field in Josephus, specifically in this passage, they believed that there were portions of the passage that were interpolations, but they did not believe that every mention of Jesus in Josephus was suspect. It's just that they think that something got added later on. And so, again, I think what we're getting to here is a recurring theme that I think it's okay to defer to specialists in a field when they're studying a historical subject. And so Carrier has offered a thesis, and his thesis needs to be reviewed by the other peers who have formally studied this. And I'd like to see them duke it out, and I'm eager to watch it. What I'm not eager to see is everybody else saying that they now know more than the authorities do on what the resolution is going to be. You know,
right.
that's what I have a problem with.
Right, and I do I love because I've watched just about a lot of Carrier's debates with other biblical historians, and I don't want to come off as me being like I read one thing that said, oh, Jesus didn't exist, and I'm like full on Jesus didn't exist, and
Right?
and whatnot. But because I've been following Carrier closely and Price, and now I'm starting to get caught up on Bartney Ehrman's arguments. But I'm just kind of curious, what kind of evidence or non-evidence, I guess, would cause you to question it? I think that you kind of hinted at that a little bit earlier in the conversation, but like, what kind of evidence would make you say, "Hey, yeah, I agree, he didn't exist"?
I would like to see more of the people whose job this is to study the history giving explanations themselves besides just two guys. Okay, people among people who are actual specialists in studying antiquity, I can name two. How many can you name that are mythicists
That are mythicists that like
within the
are
field of historical of ancient history? They're actual specialists in that field.
well, I mean, I know Carrier, and then Price. He's I know he's like a biblical more trained.
Hmm.
Um, I can't really name any others.
Why do you think that is?
Well, actually, David Fitzgerald,
Is not a biblical historian.
no, he's not. But he recently did a survey of divinity schools and colleges and whatnot, and most of them have agreements that you have to, at least on a minimalist basis, agree that Jesus existed. Like that's part of their agreement.
What?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, say that again. I must have misunderstood something you said.
well, no, a lot of the divinity schools and whatnot, and biblical study programs, they require you to sign something that says you have
At
to.
Christian schools,
Yeah.
those are not the only schools that study the Bible formally.
Well, no. He did a survey of like all the biblical study programs from Christian and non-Christian schools. Now, not all of them
And the
are like that.
non-Christian schools required that you sign an agreement that said that Jesus existed?
Well, he did a survey of all of them, and not all of them had that, but it's he said
Yeah.
that a significant percent of them. That there's a video. I mean, if you're really
I'll have to
interested in
go.
that,
I'll have to go examine that myself.
yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, there's a video from the Mythicist Milwaukee conference this past fall where he presents that data, and it's going to be in his Jesus Christ Mything in Action book. That those results will be in there.
For what it's worth, I'm a big fan of David's. He's a really fun guy.
He is. I love David, and we're kind of getting to the end here because I only really planned on this being about an hour long, and I really
Okay.
appreciate you coming on and talking to
Sure.
me about this because I mean, a lot of this debate in this particular topic gets heated really quick. I don't know if you experienced that on your page
yeah.
and on your personal wall, but I mean, like if you say it one way or another, people automatically go from passive to just outright angry about it.
Which is what happens when you talk about religion. And it's a little funny to me to see. My ears perk up when I notice atheists debating topics in the way that they've been debating them, and when I see the heat that's generated, that's an interesting thing to me. And I just kind of offered a side hand response. It was just an offhand response that I didn't even give any more thought to because I saw that 126 reference getting floating around on Facebook that day. So I just fired off an idea about that and didn't think anything of it for the next few hours. And that was like, I don't know, almost a week ago or something. And that thread is still going on my wall. And I'm like, what gives? Like I quit thinking about that several days ago. I'm like moving on to other things now, but it's still going. And that's how much heat this topic generates, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that maybe, or at least I know when I read your posts and whatnot, I initially got this feeling of, like you were saying, that you don't need to question the historicity of Jesus, that you just need to accept that he existed and don't even think about questioning it. That's that's my first feeling that I got. That's not saying that it was rational or anything like that, but that's why I read it and I reread it and I read all the responses to it and eventually I was like, well, no, that's not what he's saying. But as far as the article goes that sparked this entire thing, I think the reason why most people probably shared it out and whatnot is that they didn't read the article. They
It's
just read
crap.
the headline.
It's crap.
They just read the headline and kind of like with zeitgeist and whatnot. Now, I do
Exactly like evangelical Christians do. This is a pet peeve of mine. Forwarding articles before you've actually seen what the article says or dug into whether or not there's any legitimacy to what the article itself is arguing. That's a pet peeve. And that's why I'm going to keep bringing this up whenever I see that happen.
No, I understand, but I think the reason why people didn't feel the need to really read it or verify it or anything is because even Bart Ehrman says that there's no first century accounts of Jesus.
It agreed with their expectations and what they wanted to see an article say.
Well, right.
That's why they forwarded it. Bart Ehrman's not going to give a favorable response to that article.
Well, no, I wouldn't imagine so. I mean, but there is the fact that there aren't any first century documents that mention him, and while we both disagree
Pause. That's not true.
Okay.
From a historian's perspective, the New Testament documents themselves are not totally irrelevant to this question. The fact that they're religiously motivated does not mean that we rule them out entirely. For the sake of the study of history, the New Testament itself is still a relevant body of documents. So it's not technically accurate to say that there are no first century accounts of Jesus. That's not true. That's only true if you let the fact that those are religious documents mean that they cannot count for anything at all, like no data whatsoever. But that's not the way a historian looks at it. The historian sees the New Testament documents as a source, a biased source, albeit, but still a source of information that he has to or she has to pick through in order to try to get to the bottom of things. And I think that's one of the key things people are not getting about this topic. You can't rule out the New Testament entirely.
Well, I think that most people are seeing it as the Bible trying to verify the Bible, because the Bible is the one that makes the claim that Jesus existed in the first place.
And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but regular Joe Jesus, not so much.
Well, yeah, true, but I mean, when you consider that most of the New Testament is by Paul, and you know he says that he got his Jesus from scriptures and a revelation, and through no man did he get his gospel of Jesus. And then of course you have Mark, who had his source or whatnot that heavily.
Paul didn't write the Gospels though.
Huh?
Paul didn't write the Gospels.
Well, no. Paul didn't write the Gospels.
Most of the information we have about Jesus doesn't come from Paul. It comes from the Gospels.
Well, no. I know that, but Paul was a pretty big arguer against the using of these other Gospels. Like, I mean, he's got it in his writings, like talking about people falsely teaching about Jesus, and in several of his books he goes out to set things right with different groups of Christians.
But it was he wasn't arguing against like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Well, I think I can't remember the exact parts of Paul's writings where he argues against the use of those Gospels, but
by name.
No, not by name, because of course they didn't have names at the time.
So I'm wondering why you're saying that has to be those documents.
Well, because there's provably different sets of Christian communities that were in the works at the time. The Gospels themselves are evidence of that, because you have different versions of Jesus.
They are.
Right?
I agree.
And so Paul.
That's a key point.
Huh?
That's a key point.
Yeah.
That actually undermines the argument that Paul started all of this stuff. Because many of those communities clearly seem to predate Paul. Once you analyze what battles they were fighting within those communities, they're battles that wouldn't have even made sense in the target audiences of Paul's letters, and the battles that they were facing would have been earlier battles.
Well, right, but I'm not trying to argue that Paul started the mythological Jesus. I think. Or Jesus, or the Christian faith, basically. I'm not trying to argue that point. I don't want to get lost in that.
Okay.
I'm just saying that there was an amalgam of different Christian communities at the time. Paul was working off of one certain gospel, not multiple different gospels. He was working off of one story, and since the gospels present 4 different stories of Jesus, I mean, he couldn't have been advocating for all 4 stories. I mean, he was advocating for one specific one. I think most probably he was arguing for Mark, and because both of those would have been the earliest writings of Jesus, and not to mention the fact that Matthew and John are built off of, or not Matthew and John, sorry, Matthew and Luke are built off of Mark, and then John's kind of like Republican Jesus that's just way out there, and probably worked with the Illuminati some.
I don't know.
But anyways, I really appreciate you coming on here and taking the extra time to discuss this topic with me. And I like the fact that we could show that we can have a disagreement even as atheists, both ourselves, and we disagree on this topic, and we're not in a shouting match with each other, getting all angry and upset. We have differing opinions, and that's another reason why I wanted to have you on today, is because you have an opinion that's different than mine, and I'm not one to surround myself with people that just echo my thoughts. I like having people that think outside of what I think, and that way, I feel like it allows me to learn and grow
Sure.
personally.
That's
So,
why we call ourselves free thinkers. That's the idea.
exactly. Well, again, I really appreciate you coming on here.
My pleasure.
If you will, let everybody know where they can find you at if they happen to miss the very beginning of the show.
Sure. Yeah, I write on Patheos at Godless and Dixie, and if you just Google Godless and Dixie, you'll find it on Patheos. And Twitter handles there on the screen. So at Godless and Dixie on Twitter.
Yeah. All right, everybody, go read his stuff. He's got a lot of great articles. I've been following him for a while now on Patheos, and I guess I'll see everybody later. And I hope you have a really awesome Veterans Day there.
Thank you. You too.